Good evening, and welcome to Literary Legends, a recurring program celebrating the University of Iowa's rich literary legacy. It's wonderful to see everyone here at the Englert Theatre in Iowa City, and have many of you joining us virtually from all over the country. The opportunity to come together and hold events such as this one is exciting, and we're thrilled to be here with you tonight. My name is Kevin Kim Larson, and I am a member of the University Lecture Committee. It is a privilege to welcome you to tonight's conversation, an evening with university alum and acclaimed author T.C. Boyle. Coincidentally, our event tonight takes place during the 175th anniversary of the University of Iowa's founding. From its earliest days, the University of Iowa has nurtured the creative spark of experimentation, and today we continue to write new chapters of exploration, discovery, and engagement. We are the #1 writing university among public institutions, holding our own against the top Ivy League schools. And tonight, with our special guest, we continue to proudly celebrate the innovative and creative spirit that has helped to define our community since 1847. Iowa's tradition of writing has been guided by the principle that though writing is a solitary practice, it's one significantly enriched by the presence of other writers. As former director of the Iowa Writers' Workshop, Paul Engel, said about the program, "Our plan gives the writer a place where he can be himself, confronting the hazards and hopes of his own talent, and at the same time, he can measure his capacity against a variety of others." Through the years, some of the best writers in the world have come here to deepen their understanding of the craft of writing. The University of Iowa claims among its faculty and graduates winners of virtually every major literary award, including the Nobel Prize in Literature, Pulitzer Prize, 6 recent U.S. Poets Laureate, and numerous winners of the National Book Award, MacArthur Foundation Fellowships, and other major honors. And therefore, we confidently and proudly call Iowa the Writing University. We'd like to thank our partners whose contributions and hard work have made this event a reality. Specifically, we'd like to thank the UNESCO City of Literature and the Iowa City Book Festival, the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and the University of Iowa Center for Advancement. Before the program began, you received cards to jot down questions you might have for TC. These have been collected, and we'll get through as many as we can during the Q&A session. For those of you online, you can join the conversation as well by sharing comments about your favorite T.C. Boyle work or posing questions you would like to ask our guest. It's easy. Just tweet your comment or question and use the hashtag #UILiteraryLegends. We look forward to hearing from you all. With that being said, we're thrilled to have T.C. Boyle here with us tonight. Boyle received an MFA degree in creative writing at the Iowa Writers' Workshop in 1974 and a PhD in 19th century British literature in the Department of English in 1977. Since the mid-1970s, he has published 29 books of fiction, with his 30th coming out this fall, and more than 100 short stories that explore topics ranging from historical biography to ecological apocalypse, and tackling themes such as environmentalism, fanaticism, and the unintended consequences of technology. Boyle's work has been recognized by the Academy of Arts and Sciences and through awards that include creative writing fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and a Guggenheim. Boyle can also lay claim to the Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction, Penn Malmed Prize, the Penn West Literary Prize, the Commonwealth Gold Medal for Literature, 6 O. Henry Awards for short fiction, and a multitude of Best American Short Story Awards. In 2008, Boyle was awarded the University of Iowa's Distinguished Alumni Award for Achievement, and he was previously a Distinguished Professor of English at the University of Southern California. During our program, TC will be joined on stage by our moderator, Dr. Lauren Glass, who is a professor and chair of the English department here at the university. And now, to introduce himself and welcome you all, I'd like to welcome to the stage T.C. Boyle.
Well, hello, folks. I just want to say a few words before Lauren and I chat, and then I'm going to perform a story for you, the thing I like to do best in this whole world. And I should say, I'm greatly honored to be a literary legend. a living one rather than a dead one. Vance Bergeli was my mentor when I first began in the workshop, and since I was here for 5.5 years, I published a lot of stories in the meantime in various magazines, and I asked Vance to have a blurb for my first book, which came out in 1979, and there on the front is Vance's blurb. T.C. Boyle, almost a legend.
Well, TC, welcome back to Iowa City.
Thanks, David. It's a joy to be here.
You've returned here many times, and so my first question is about Iowa City. What has the town meant to you over time, and how has it changed over the decades that you've been coming back and visiting?
I'm sorry, Lauren, I just called you David.
You did. I look like a David.
No, you look like a Lauren, totally. The core of the city remains the same, the downtown. Of course, the the limits of it are unrecognizable.
The developers have been at work out there.
They sure have, and these high rises in town, I'm not that thrilled about them, but again, I've left town. I don't live here anymore. I live in Santa Barbara, so I'm sorry for all of you.
Are there particular institutions you remember or have nostalgic feelings about, places you used to hang out? I know someone saw you at George's last night.
Yes, primarily the bars, of course. The Mill is gone and the Foxhead is gone and so on. Today, I was wandering around, as I always do, with tears streaming down my cheeks while muttering to myself, and I went into McBride to go up to the third floor and see the stuffed animals, a thing that I love to do, and when my children were here, I would take them as well. And to get from the mammal exhibit to the bird exhibit, you have to walk through the second floor of the big auditorium there, and I began to reminisce. I had seen so many writers there. I remember in that auditorium, Kurt Vonnegut one night, Borges was there, John Updike. And I remember also being part of an audience like this for the probably weekly visits of all of the writers whom we so much admired on the page. And we just wanted to see who they were in the flesh. Now, most of them were, of course, despicable people, and they wanted nothing to do with us. But nonetheless, to just observe them at the party afterwards, you know, while they were, well, I won't get into that, but just to observe that the people you admire so much on the page are actually living. I came to the idea of being a writer rather late in undergraduate school, and I didn't really associate words on the page with some living human being. And maybe that was a fault of the high school English department, I don't know. But it was a particular thrill to be here to do, as an audience member, what we're doing tonight. I saw so many of my literary heroes here. A lot of them didn't read very well, but it didn't matter. You want to hear their intonation, their rhythm, their voice.
And what did the workshop, how did it affect your career? Obviously a turning point, and obviously you're proud to get in, and you were part of a very illustrious cohort in the 70s. You've also said that most of your mentors were more like coaches than teachers, sort of patting you on the back and telling you you were doing great. What was it like to attend the workshop in the 70s, and maybe how has writing pedagogy changed or developed since then?
We didn't really have vocabulary or how to talk about the stories. I think the innovation of the workshop, which I always used in my classes ever after, is to have the stories printed up in advance. And when I taught my classes, you know, the writer has already been read and written about, and then we would discuss the stories in terms of interpretation. But in my day, it was a little more chaotic and a little more competitive, and maybe sometimes it got out of hand. But all in all, what I needed most of all was some affirmation and someone who would support me. And the teachers I had in the workshop were certainly fulfilled that bill, John Cheever, Vance, and Vance's former student, John Irving. And then in the English department, I had Frederick P.W. McDowell was the chair of my committee. Miriam Gilbert was my first year and just lit me up to Shakespeare and performance, which I had no idea about. Dave Morrell, who was here in those days, did a special subject with me on American literature. He was great. John Huntley. There are just so many who were totally important to me and changed my life.
And what about the other students? I know you were in classes with Alan Gurganus, Jane Smiley, Dennis Johnson was here when you were here, Tracy Kidder was here when you were here. Do you have memories of the cohort? Did you guys identify as a cohort? Are you still in touch?
I didn't make friends with many of my fellow writers, but Ron Hansen was one who I was friends with in those days, and a couple of the others too. I was, as you probably heard on the radio show, I had a foot in both camps. I was both a writer and an academic with the PhD. So whenever the writers wanted to go do something, hey man, let's go do this, I would say, no, I'm an academic, I can't do that, and vice versa. So I had a nice skate down the middle.
Were there divisions or tensions between the PhDs and the MFA cohorts, or was it pretty amicable, or was it standard to go over into the PhD camp as you did? And what impelled you to do that, to stay on and get the next level degree?
Well, we didn't wear gang jackets and we didn't beat each other up. Aside from that, I don't really know. And again, as I've said many times, this place just saved my life. I was a directionless and a drug-addled kid living in New York, and I came here. I'd never been here before, and it lit me up. And from the day I got here, instead of taking the form of fiction classes, in addition to the workshop, I immediately began taking academic classes because I wanted to know something. I had been a pretty poor undergrad and didn't do what I was supposed to do, and didn't go to class, and didn't read the books that were assigned. And so I really felt I needed a foundation. If you're going to write, it'd be helpful to know something. So I was dedicated, absolutely dedicated from the day I got here. And that part of it was hugely important for me as well. And by the way, John Cheever was only educated to the 11th grade in high school. He was kicked out of the Thayer Academy for smoking, and he never had a formal education. And of course, one of the most erudite and brilliant people I've ever met. He was totally antithetical to my getting a PhD. He felt that art and academia have nothing to do with each other. And of course, I take his point. But in my case, I needed it. I needed the foundation. And it resulted in my first novel, Water Music, this enormous, ambitious first book, which I think reflected a lot of what I learned in the PhD program.
And what were those writers that ended up being foundational to you? I know you've mentioned Flannery O'Connor. You've also mentioned some of the great postmodern writers of that era, Coover and Barth. Mm-hmm. Were there particular folks in that crucial period of your education that really sparked you, or that you learned from, or maybe that you imitated?
Yes, absolutely. The experimental writing of that period in the late 60s and early 70s really hooked me. I think the first time I got turned on to writing was with Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, which I read in a second-year class of the American Short Story. And it blew me away because of its wicked undercurrent of sense of humor, but also because here was a situation out of a sitcom, and yet she stabbed you in the heart with it, and I didn't know you could do that. Also at the same time, and as an undergrad, we were studying the absurdist playwrights, which really appealed to my sense of the world and my sense of humor. And they led to people like John Barth and Barthelme and Isidro Calvino and the great Latin American writers like Borges, aforementioned Borges, and Garcia Marquez, and Miguel Angel Asturias, and many, many others. And that formed my aesthetic when I first began writing. However, there are limitations to that approach. And while I was here, I got to know Ray Carver, who became a friend, and I admired what he was doing in a straight, realistic way. And I felt, why limit myself? So I think people say, why have you been so productive? I think it's because I can write in any mode for any given story.
And that came pretty much naturally to you, or you picked it up as you were going along? I know you worked hard while you were here, but there's a sense that folks were like, yeah, he's doing well. Let's keep, patting him on the back, giving him A's and getting him published.
Oh, shucks, Lauren, I'm just doing what comes natural.
Of course.
Which reminds me that I think I ought to read a story now.
So I've heard, yes.
Okay, all right.
Let's listen.
Thank you. This is a story that I love to perform because it will introduce you to a character who you're not going to like. And I may have to resort to this device right here. This is called The Lie. I'd used up all my sick days and the 2 personal days they allowed us. But when the alarm went off and the baby started squalling and my wife threw back the covers to totter off to the bathroom in a hobbled 2-legged trot, I knew I wasn't going into work. It was as if a black shroud had been pulled over my face. My eyes were open, but I couldn't see. Or no, I could see the pulsing LED display on the clock radio, the mounds of laundry and discarded clothes humped round the room like the tumuli of the dead, a hard driving rain drooling down the dark vacancy of the window. But everything seemed to have a film over it, a world coated in Vaseline. The baby let out a series of scaled-back cries. The toilet flushed. The overhead light flicked on. Clover was back in the room, the baby flung over one shoulder. She was wearing an old Cramps t-shirt she liked to sleep in and nothing else. I might have found this sexy to one degree or another, but for the fact that I wasn't at my best in the morning, and I'd seen her naked, save for a one rock and roll memento t-shirt for something like 1,000 consecutive mornings now. It's 6:15, she said. I said nothing. My eyes eased shut. I heard her at the closet. And in the dream that crashed down on me in that instant, she metamorphosed from a rippling human female with a baby slung over one shoulder to a great shining bird springing from the brink of a precipice and sailing on great shining wings into the void. I woke to the baby on the bed beside me. You change her, my wife said. You feed her. I'm late as it is. We'd had some people over the night before, friends from the pre-baby days. And we'd made margaritas in the blender, watched a movie, and stayed up late talking about nothing and everything. Clover had shown off the baby, Xana. We'd named her Xana after a character in one of the movies I'd edited, or actually logged. And I'd felt a rush of pride. Here was this baby, perfect in every way, beautiful because her parents were beautiful. And that was all right. Tank, he'd been in my band, co-leader, co-founder, and we'd written stories together till that went sour. Said she was fat enough to eat, and I'd said, yeah, just let me fire up the Barbie. And Clover had given me her little drawn-down pout of disgust because I was being juvenile. We stayed up till the rain started. I poured one more round of margaritas, and then Tuck's girlfriend opened her maw in a yawn that could have sucked in the whole condo and the street out front, too, and the party broke up. Now I was in bed, and the baby was crawling up my right leg, giving off a powerful reek of shit. The clock inched forward. Clover got dressed, put on her makeup, and took her coffee mug out to the car and was gone. There was nothing heroic in what I did next, dealing with the baby and my own car and the stalled nose-to-tail traffic that made the 3 miles to the babysitters seem like a trek across the wastelands of the earth. It was just life, that was all. But as soon as I handed Xana over to Violetta at the door of her apartment that threw up a wall of cooking smells, tearful Telemundo dialogue, and the diachronic yapping of her 4 chihuahuas, I slammed into the car and called in sick. Or no, not sick. My sick days were gone, I reminded myself, and my personal days too. My boss picked up the phone. Iron House Productions. he said over the phone. Digging out from under the R's. He had trouble with R's. He had trouble with English, for that matter. Hello, Radko. Yes, it is he. Who is it now? It's me, Lonnie. Let me guess, you are sick. Radko was one of that select group of hard chargers in the production business who kept morning hours, and that was good for me because with Clover working days and going to law school at nights, and the baby, of course, my own availability was restricted to the daylight hours when Violetta's own children were at school and her husband at work operating one of the cranes that lifted the beams to build the city out till there was nothing green left for 50 miles around. But Radko had promised me career advancement, moving up from logging footage to actual editing, and that hadn't happened. On this particular morning, as on too many mornings in the past, I felt I just couldn't face the editing bay, the computer screen, the eternal idiocy of the dialogue repeated over and over through take after take, frame after frame. No, Jim, stop. No, Jim, stop. No, Jim, stop. I used to be in a band. I had a college degree. I was no drudge. Before I could think, it was out. It's the baby, I said. There was a silence I might have read too much into. Then Radko, dicing the interrogative, said, "What baby? Mine? My baby? Remember the pictures Clover sent everybody?" My brain was doing cartwheels. 9 months ago, when she was born? Another long pause. Finally, he said, "Yes." "Well, she's sick. She's very sick with a fever and all that. We don't know what's wrong with her." The wheel of internal calculus spun one more time, and I made another leap, the one that would prove to be fatal. "I'm at the hospital now?" As soon as I hung up, I felt as if I'd been pumped full of helium, giddy with it, rising right out of my seat. But then the slow seepage of guilt, dread, and fear started in, drip by drip, like bile drained out of a liver gone bad. A delivery truck pulled up next to me. Rain beat at the windshield. 2 cholos rolled out of the apartment next to Violetta's, the green block tattoos they wore like collars glistening in the light trapped beneath the clouds. I had the whole day in front of me. I could do anything, go anywhere. An hour ago, it was sleep I wanted. Now it was something else. A pulse of excitement, the promise of illicit thrills started up in my stomach. I drove down Ventura Boulevard in the opposite direction from the bulk of the commuters. They were stalled at the lights, a single driver in every car. The cars themselves like steel shells they'd extruded to contain their resentments. They were going to work. I wasn't. After a mile or so, I came to a diner where I sometimes took Clover for breakfast on Sundays, especially if we'd been out the night before. And on an impulse, I pulled into the lot. I bought a newspaper from the machine out front. And then I took a copy of the free paper, too, and went on in and settled into a seat by the window. The smell of fresh coffee and home fries made me realize how hungry I was, and I ordered the kind of breakfast I used to have in college after a night of excess. Salt, sugar, and grease in quantity, just to open my pores. While I ate, I made my way through both newspapers, item by item, because this was luxurious, kingly, the tables clean, the place brightly lit and warm to the point of steaming with the bustle of the waitresses and the rain at the windows like a plague. Nobody said a word to me. Nobody even looked at me, but for my waitress. She was middle-aged, wedded to her uniform, her hair dyed shoe-polish black. "More coffee?" she asked for the 3rd or 4th time. "No hurry, no rush, just an invitation." I glanced at my watch and couldn't believe it was only 9:30. That was the thing about taking a day off, the way the time reconfigured itself and how you couldn't help comparing any given moment with what you'd be doing at work. At work, I wouldn't have eaten yet, wouldn't have even reached a coffee break. "Jim, stop, no!" And my eyelids would have weighed 10 tons each. I thought about driving down to the ocean to see what the surf looked like under the pressure of the storm. Not that I was thinking of surfing. I hadn't been surfing more than a handful of times since the baby was born. I wound my way down through Topanga Canyon. The computer traffic dissipated now. And I saw how the creek was tearing at the banks, and there were 2 or 3 places where there was water on the road, and the soft red dough of the mud was like something that had come out of a mold. There was nobody on the beach but me. I walked along the shore till the brim of my baseball cap was sodden and the legs of my jeans as heavy as if they'd just come out of the washing machine. I drove back up the canyon, The rain a little worse, the flooding more obvious and intense, but it wasn't anything really, not like when the road washes out and you could be driving one minute and the next flailing for your life in a chute full of piss-colored water. There was a movie or two I was interested in, but since it was just past 12 and I couldn't even think about lunch after the lumberjack special I'd had for breakfast, I went back to the condo, parked the car, and walked down the street, getting wetter and wetter and enjoying every minute of it, to a bar I knew. The door swung in on a denseness of purpose. 8 or 9 losers lined up on their bar stools, the smell of cut lime and the sunshine of the rum, a straight shot of Lysol from the toilet and back. It was warm, dark. A college basketball game hovered on the screen over the cash register. A beer, I said, and then clarified by specifying the brand. I didn't get drunk. That would have been usual, and I didn't want to be usual. But I did have 3 beers before I went to the movie, and after the movie I felt a vacancy in my lower reaches where lunch should have been, and so I stopped at a fast food place on my way to pick up the baby. They got my order wrong. The employees were glassy-eyed. The manager was nowhere to be seen. And I was 35 minutes late for the baby. Still, I'd had my day. And when I got home, I fed the baby her cream of wheat, opened a beer, put on some music, and began chopping garlic and dicing onions with the notion of concocting a marinara sauce for my wife when she got home. Thoughts of the following morning, of Radko and what he might think or expect, never entered my mind. Not yet. All was well. The baby in her crib batting at the little figurines in the mobile over her head, the figurines personally welded to the wires by Clover's hippie mother, so there wasn't even the faintest possibility the baby could get them lodged in her throat. The sauce bubbling on the stove, the rain tapping at the windows. I heard Clover's key in the lock. And then she was there with her hair kinked from the rain and smelling like everything I'd ever wanted. And she was asking how my day had gone, and I said, fine, just fine. Then it was morning again, and the same scene played itself out. Clover stutter-stepping to the bathroom, the baby mewling, rain whispering under the soundtrack. And I began to calculate all over again. It was Thursday. 2 more days to the weekend. If I could make it to the weekend, I was sure that by Monday at the latest, whatever was wrong with me, this feeling of anger, hopelessness, turmoil, whatever it was, would be gone. Just a break. I just needed a break, that was all. And Radko, the thought of facing him, of the way he would mold the drooping dog-like folds of his Slavic flesh around the suspicion in his eyes while he told me he was docking me a day's pay and expected me to work overtime to make up for yesterday, was too much to hold on to. Not in bed, not now. But then the toilet flushed, the baby squalled, and the overhead light went on. It's 6:15, my wife informed me. The evening before, after we dined on my marinara sauce with porcini mushrooms and Italian-style turkey sausage over penne pasta, in the interval before she put the baby down for the night while the dishwasher murmured from the kitchen and we lingered over a second glass of Chianti, she told me she was thinking about changing her name. What do you mean? I was more surprised than angry, but I felt the anger come up in me all the same. My name's not good enough for you, like it was my idea to get married in the first place? She had the baby in her lap. The baby was in high spirits, grinning her toothless baby grin and snatching for the wine glass my wife held just out of reach. You don't have to get nasty about it. It's not your name that's the problem. It's mine. My first name? What's wrong with Clover? I said. And even as I said it, I knew how stupid it sounded. She was Clover. I could close my eyes, and she was Clover. Go to Africa and bury myself in mud, and she'd still be Clover. Fine. But the name was a hippie affectation of her hippie parents. They were glassblowers with their own gallery, and it was insipid. I knew that down deep. They might as well have named her Dandelion or Fescue. I was thinking of changing it to Chloris. She was watching me, her eyes defiant and insecure at the same time. Legally? I saw her point. She was a legal secretary studying to be a lawyer, and Clover just wouldn't fly on a masthead. But I hated the name, hated the idea. Sounds like something you clean the toilet with, I said. She shot me a look of hate. With bleach in it, I said, with real scrubbing power. But now, though I felt as if I'd been crucified and wanted only to sleep for a week, till Monday, just till Monday, I sat up before she could lift the baby from the crib and drop her on the bed. And in the next moment, I was in the bathroom myself, staring into the mirror. As soon as she left, I was going to call Radko. I would tell him the baby was worse, that we'd been in the hospital all night. And if he asked what was wrong with her, I wasn't going to equivocate, because equivocation, any kind of uncertainty, a tremor in the voice, a tonal shift, play acting, is the surest lie detector. Leukemia, that was what I was going to tell him. The baby has leukemia. This time, I waited till I was settled into the booth at the diner, and the waitress with the shoe polish hair had got done fussing over me, the light of recognition in her eyes and a maternal smile creasing her lips. I was a regular 2 days in a row, before I called in. And when Radko answered, the deepest consonant battering pole of suspicion lodged somewhere between his glottis and adenoids, I couldn't help myself. It's the baby, I said, holding it a beat. The baby passed. Another beat. The waitress poured. Radko breathed fumes through the receiver. It was last night at 4 a.m. There was nothing they could do. Passed? His voice came back at me. What is this past? The baby's dead, I said. She died. And then, in my grief, I broke the connection. I spent the entire day at the movies. The first show was at 11, and I killed time pacing around the parking lot in the mall till they opened the doors, and then I was inside, in the anonymous dark. Images flashed by on the screen. The sound was amplified to a killing roar. The smell of melted butter hung over everything. When the lights came up, I ducked into the men's room, and then slipped into the next theater, and the next one after that. I emerged at 4:15, feeling shaky. I told myself I was hungry, that was all. But when I wandered into the food court and saw what they had arrayed there, from chapatis to corn dogs to twice-cooked machaca, pretzels, and Szechuan eggplant in a sauce of liquid fire, I pushed through the door of a bar instead. It was one of those over-sanitized, too bright echoing spaces the mall designers, in their wisdom, stuck in the back of their plastic restaurants so that the average moron accompanying his wife on a shopping expedition wouldn't have to kill himself. There was a basketball game on the 3 TVs encircling the bar. The waitresses were teenagers. The bartender had acne. I was the only customer. And I knew I had to pick up the baby. That was a given. That was a fact of life. But I ordered a Captain and Coke just for the smell of it. I was on my second or maybe my third when the place began to fill up. And I realized with a stab of happiness that this must have been an after-work hangout, with a prescribed happy hour and some sort of comestibles served up gratis on a heated tray. I'd been wrapped up in my grief, a grief that was all for myself, for the fact that I was 26 years old and going nowhere with a baby to take care of and a wife in the process of flogging a law degree and changing her name because she wasn't who she used to be. And now suddenly, I came awake. There were women everywhere. Women my age and older, leaning into the bar with their earrings swaying, lined up at the door, sitting at tables, legs crossed, feet tapping rhythmically to the canned music. Me, I had to pick up the baby. I checked my watch and saw that I was already late for the second day running. But I was hungry all of a sudden. And I thought I'd just maybe have a couple of the taquitos everybody else was shoving into their mouths while I finished my drink. Then I'd get in the car, take the back streets to Violetta's, and be home just before my wife, and see if we could get another meal out of the marinara sauce with porcini mushrooms and turkey sausage. That was when I felt a pressure on my arm, my left arm, and I lifted my chin to glance over my shoulder into the face of Joel Chanowski, who occupied the bay next to mine at Iron House Productions. At first I didn't recognize him, one of those tricks of the mind, the inebriated mind especially, in which you can't place people out of context, though you know them absolutely. Joel, I said. He was shaking his head very slowly, as if he were tolling a bell, as if his eyes were the clappers and his skull the ringing shell of it. He had a big head, huge. He was big all around, one of those people who aren't obese, or not exactly, but just overgrown to the extent that his clothes seemed inflated, his pants, his jacket, even his socks. He was wearing a tie, the only one of the 76 employees at Iron House to dress in shirt and tie, and it looked like a toy trailing away from his supersized collar. "Aw, shit, man," he said, squeezing tighter. "Shit." Yeah, I said, and my head was tolling too. I felt caught out. Felt like the very essence he was naming, like shit, that is. Oh man, we all heard. He removed his hand from my arm, peered into his palm as if trying to divine what to say next. Man, it sucks. It really sucks. Yeah, I said. And then, though his face never changed, he seemed to brighten it around the eyes for just an instant. Hey, he said, can I buy you a drink? I mean, to drown the sorrow. I mean, that's what you're doing, right? And I don't blame you, not at all. If it was me, he let the thought trail off. There was a girl 2 stools down from me, her hair pulled up in a long, trailing ponytail, and she was wearing a knit jumper over a little black skirt and red leggings. She glanced up at me, 2 green, swimming eyes above a pair of lips pursed at the straw of her drink. Or maybe, Joel said, maybe you'd rather be alone? I dragged my eyes away from the girl. The truth is, I said, I mean, I really appreciate it, but like I'm meeting Clover at the funeral parlor, you know, to make the arrangements, and I just stopped for a drink, that's all. Oh, man. Joel was practically erupting from his shoes, his face drawn down like a curtain and every blood vessel in his eyes gone to waste. I understand completely. On the way out the door, I dug out my cell and dialed via letter to tell her my wife would be picking up the baby tonight because I was working late, and then I left a message to the same effect at my wife's law office. Then I went out looking for a bar where I could find something to eat and maybe one last drink before I went home to lie some more. The next day, Friday, I didn't even bother to call in, but I was feeling marginally better. I had a mild hangover, my head still clanging dully, and my stomach shriveled up around a little nugget of nothing, so that after I dropped the baby off, I wasn't able to take anything more than dry toast and black coffee at the diner that was fast becoming my second home. And yet, the force of the lie, the enormity of it, was behind me. And here, outside the windows, the sun was shining for the first time in days. I'd been listening to the surf report in the car on the way over. We were getting 6-foot swells as a result of the storm. And after breakfast, I dug out my wetsuit and my board and let the Pacific roll on under me until I forgot everything in the world but the taste of salt and the smell of the breeze and the weird, strangled cries of the gulls. I was home by 3, and I vacuumed, washed the dishes, scrubbed the counters. I was 20 minutes early to pick up Xana, and while dinner was cooking, meatloaf with boiled potatoes in their skins and asparagus vinaigrette, I took her to the park and listened to her screech with baby joy as I held her in my lap and rocked higher and higher on the swings. When Clover came home, she was too tired to fight, and she accepted the meatloaf and the wine I'd picked out as the peace offerings they were. And after the baby was asleep, we listened to music, smoked a joint, and made love in a slow, deep plunge that was like paddling out on a wave of flesh for what seemed like hours. We took a drive up the coast on Saturday, and on Sunday afternoon we went over to Tank's for lunch and saw how sad his apartment was with its brick and board bookcases, the faded band posters curling away from the walls, and the deep pile rug that was once off-white and was now just plain dirty. In the car on the way home, Clover said she never could understand people who treated their dog as if they'd given birth to it. And I shook my head, tolling it, but easily now, thankfully, and said I couldn't agree more. I woke on Monday before the alarm went off, and I was showered and shaved and in the car before my wife left for work. And when I pulled up in front of the long, windowless, gray stucco edifice that housed Iron House Productions, I was so early, Radko himself hadn't showed up yet. I took off my watch and stuffed it deep in my pocket, letting the monotony of work drag me down till I was conscious of nothing, not my fingers at the keyboard, or the image on the screen, or the dialogue I was capturing, frame by frozen frame. At some point, it must have been an hour in, 2 hours, I don't know, I became aware of the intense, gland-clenching aroma of vanilla chai. Hot, spiced, blended, the very thing I wanted, caffeine to drive a stake into the boredom. Vanilla chai available at the coffee house down the street, but a real indulgence because of the cost. Usually, I made do with the acidic black coffee and artificial creamer Radko provided on a stained cart set up against the back wall. I lifted my head to search out the aroma, and there was Jeannie, the secretary from the front office, holding a paperboard venti in one hand and a platter of what turned out to be homemade cannoli in the other. "What?" I said, thinking Radko had sent her to tell me he wanted to see me in his office. But she didn't say anything for a long, excruciating moment, her eyes full, her face white as a mask. And then she shoved the chai into my hand and set the tray down on the desk beside me. "I am so sorry for your loss," she said. And then I felt her hand on my shoulder, and she was dipping forward in a typhoon of perfume to plant a lugubrious kiss just beneath my left ear. What can I say? I felt bad about the whole business, felt low and despicable. But I cracked the plastic lid and sipped the chai, and as if I wasn't even aware of what my fingers were doing, I started in on the cannoli one by one till the platter was bare. I was just sucking the last of the sugar from my fingertips when Steve Bartholomew, a guy of 30 or so who worked in special effects, a guy I barely knew, came up to me and without a word pressed a tin of butter cookies into my hand. "Hey," I said, addressing his retreating shoulders. "Thanks, man, thanks. It means a lot." By noon, my desk was piled high with foodstuffs, sandwiches, sweets, a dry salami as long as my forearm, and at least a dozen gray-jacketed sympathy cards inscribed by one coworker or another. I wanted to hide, wanted to quit, wanted to go home, tear the phone out of the wall, get into bed, and never leave. But I didn't. I just sat there trying to work, giving one person after another a zombie smile and my best impression of the 1,000-yard stare. Just before quitting time, Radko appeared, his face like an old paper bag left out in the rain. He was flanked by Joel Chanowski. I glanced up at them out of wary eyes, and in a flash of intuition, I realized how much I hated them both, how much I wanted only to jump to my feet like a cornered animal and punch them out, both of them. Radko said nothing. He just stood there gazing down at me, and then, after a moment, he pressed one hand to my shoulder in Slavic commiseration, turned, and walked away. "Listen, man," Joel said, shifting his eyes away from mine. "We all wanted to, well, we got together, me and some of the others, and I know it isn't much, but..." I saw now that he was holding a plastic grocery sack in one hand. I knew what was in the sack. I tried to wave it away, but he thrust it at me, and I had no choice but to take it. Later, when I got home, and the baby was in her high chair and smearing her face with cream of wheat, and I'd slipped the microwave pizza out of its box, I sat down and emptied the contents of the bag on the kitchen table. It was mainly cash, but there were maybe half a dozen checks, too. I saw one for $25, another for $50. The baby made one of those expressions of baby joy, sharp and sudden, as if the impulse had seized her before she could process it. It was 5:30, and the sinking sun was pasted over the windows. I sifted the bills through my hands, 10s and 20s, 5s, a lot of 5s, and surprisingly few singles, thinking how generous my coworkers were, how good and real and giving. But I was grieving all the same, grieving beyond any measure I could ever have imagined or contained. I was in the process of counting the money, thinking I'd give it back or donate it to some charity, when I heard Clover's key in the lock, and I swept it all back into the bag and tucked that bag in the deep recess under the sink where the water persistently dripped from the crusted over pipe and the old sponge there smelled of mold. The minute my wife left the next morning, I called Radko and told him I wasn't coming in. He didn't ask for an excuse, but I gave him one anyway. "The funeral," I said. "It's at 11 a.m., just family, very private. My wife is taking it hard." He made some sort of noise on the other end of the line, a sigh, a belch, the faintest cracking of his knuckles. "Tomorrow," I said. "I'll be in tomorrow without fail." And then the day began. But it wasn't like that first day, not at all. I didn't feel giddy, didn't feel liberated or even relieved. All I felt was regret and the cold drop of doom. I deposited the baby at Violetta's and went straight home to bed, wanting only to clear some space for myself and think things out. There was no way I could return the money. I wasn't that good an actor. And I couldn't spend it either, even to make up for the loss of pay. That would have been low, lower than anything I'd ever done in my life. I thought of Clover then, how furious she'd be when she found out my pay had been docked. If it had been docked. There was still a chance Radko would let it slide given the magnitude of my tragedy, a chance he was human after all, yeah, a good chance. No, the only thing to do was bury the money someplace. I'd burn the checks first. I couldn't run the risk of anybody uncovering them. That would have been a real disaster, magnitude 10. Nobody could explain that. though various scenarios were already suggesting themselves. A thief had stolen the bag from the glove box of my car. It had blown out the window on the freeway while I was on my way to the mortuary. The neighbor's pet macaque had come in through the open window and made off with it, wadding the checks and chewing up the money till it was just monkey feces now. Monkey feces, monkey feces. I found myself repeating the phrase over and over as if it were a prayer. It was a little past 9 when I had my first beer. And for the rest of the day, till I had to pick up the baby, I never moved from the couch. I tried to gauge Clover's mood when she came in the door, dressed like a lawyer in her gray herringbone jacket and matching skirt, her hair pinned up and her eyes in traffic mode. The place was a mess. I hadn't picked up, hadn't put on anything for dinner. The baby, asleep in her molded plastic carrier, gave off a stink you could smell all the way across the room. I looked up from my beer. "I thought we'd go out tonight," I told her. "My treat." And then, because I just couldn't help myself, I added, "I'm just trash from work." She wasn't happy about it. I could see that. Lawyerly calculations transfiguring her face as she weighed the hassle of running up the boulevard with her husband and baby in tow before leaving for her 8 o'clock class. I watched her reach back to remove the clip from her hair and shake it loose. "Oh, I guess," she said, "but no Italian." She'd set down her briefcase in the entry hall where the phone was, and she put a thumb in her mouth a moment, a habit of hers. She was a fingernail chewer. Before she said, "Well, what about Chinese?" She shrugged before I could. "You know," she said, "as long as it's quick, I don't really care." I was about to agree with her, about to rise up out of the grip of the couch and do my best to minister to the baby and get us out the door en famille, when the phone rang. Clover answered. "Hello? This is she." My right knee cracked as I stood, a reminder of the torn ACL I'd suffered in high school when I'd made the slightest miscalculation regarding the drop off the backside of a boulder while snowboarding at Mammoth. "Jeannie," my wife said, her eyebrows lifting in 2 perfect arches. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Jeannie, how are you?" There was a long pause as Jeannie said what she was going to say. And my wife said, "Oh no, there must be some mistake. The baby's fine. She's right here in her carrier, fast asleep." And her voice grew heartier, surprise and confusion riding the cusp of the joke. "She could use a fresh diaper, judging from the smell of her, but that's her daddy's job, or it's going to be if we ever expect to..." And then there was another pause, longer this time, and I watched my wife's gaze shift from the form of the sleeping baby in her terry cloth jumpsuit to where I was standing beside the couch. Her eyes, in soft focus for the baby, hardened as they climbed from my shoe tops to my face, where they rested like 2 bowls of granite. Anybody would have melted under that kind of scrutiny. My wife, the lawyer. It would be a long night. I could see that. There would be no Chinese, no food of any kind. I found myself denying everything, telling her how scattered Jeannie was and how she must have confused us with the Lovetts. You remember Tony Lovett worked in SFX? Yeah, they just lost their baby, a little girl. Yeah, no, it was awful. I told her we'd all chipped in. Me too. I put in a 50, and that was excessive, I know it, but I felt I had to, because of the baby. Because what if it happened to us? I went on in that vein till I ran out of breath, and when I tried to be nonchalant about it and go to the refrigerator for another beer, she blocked my way. "Where's the money?" she said. We were 2 feet apart. I didn't like the look she was giving me because it spared nothing. I could have kept it up, could have said, "What money?" injecting all the trampled innocence I could summon into my voice, but I didn't. I merely bent to the cabinet under the sink, extracted the white plastic bag, and handed it to her. She took it as if it were the bleeding corpse of our daughter. Or no, of our relationship that went back 3 years to the time when I was up on stage, gilded in light, my message elided under the hammer of the guitar and the thump of the bass. She didn't look inside. She just held my eyes. "You know this is fraud, don't you?" she said. "A felony offense? They can lock you up for this. You know that?" She wasn't asking a question. She was making a demand. And I wasn't about to answer her because the baby was dead and she was dead too. Radko was dead, Jeannie the secretary whose last name I didn't even know, and Joel Chanowski and all the rest of them. Very slowly, button by button, I did up my shirt. Then I set my empty beer bottle down on the counter as carefully as if it were full to the lip and went on out the door and into the night, looking for somebody I could tell all about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You are one of a handful of contemporary writers that's really maintained your allegiance to the short story as well as to the novel, and I'm wondering how you think about the difference between those two, whether you know whether when you start something it's going to be a short story or a novel, and what you think about the difference between them generically, how we read them, where they belong, what role they play in your career.
I am totally dedicated to both forms. Unlike most, in the preface to the second volume of my collected stories, T.C. Boyle Stories 2, I mention an incident when Stanley Elkin was giving a reading, and one student raised his hand and asked this question. Well, Mr. Elkin, you've written this wonderful book of stories, Criers and Gibitzers, Gibitzers and Criers. Are you going to write another? No. No money in it. Next question. So that was a little disillusioning, but you know, I've always gone my own way, and I felt, okay, I want to write stories too. So throughout, you can see all the books coming from me. Generally speaking, or well, almost exactly, there's a novel, 2 collections, and a novel. It's because a collection, 2 novels, and then a collection. It's because after you write a novel, you're so exhausted mentally that you can't, unless you're Anthony Trollope, you can't just start the next one. So I love to do stories. I love the form, and I love also that anything that occurs to me or that's happening in this madhouse society we're living in, I can't address when I'm writing a novel because I'm locked in. Sometimes it's an historical novel, and I can't really deal with that. So I get some ideas and store them up, and they're not anything elaborate. It's a 1-sentence thing in a notebook, you know, the guy who lied about his dead baby. And then when it's time to write stories, I look through those and see if any of them will happen. So I really need it, not only because I love the short story, but rhythmically for my creativity. I just need it.
Fascinating. I had a thematic question. We talked about this a little bit backstage, speaking of the madness of our society. Many of your novels focus on what the sociologist Max Weber called charismatic communities, small communities of people whose allegiance to an individual, usually male leader is unqualified and total, usually with unfortunate circumstances. And I wondered what fascinates you about these Timothy Leary types or these charismatic leader types. Are they just interesting people to build a story around, or is there a larger social question you're
because I'm
there?
An arrant punk and have been all my life, even as an old man. I can't imagine anybody telling me what to do. Yeah. And the idea, and I don't want to get into politics right now, it's too distressing, but you know, the guru says, life is difficult, give yourself to me, body and soul, and I will take care of you. And my question is, well, what does that do for you? And what does that do for your soul and your being? Last night we had the film scene, and there was a screening of the movie that Alan Parker made of my book, The Road to Wellville, about such a charismatic figure, John Harvey Kellogg, who invented the cornflake. Anthony Hopkins played him with great menace because he had just been Hannibal Lecter in a movie before. Then, of course, I wrote about Alfred C. Kinsey, the inventor of sex, and more recently about a follower of Timothy Leary, who was a grad student who was expected to trip. Leary expected. It was a club. You couldn't be a student without going on an acid trip. And I wanted to examine that because the aforementioned Fred McDowell, he didn't want me to go on acid trips. All he wanted me to do was study English literature, and I think that's the way it should be. But when you give yourself over to body and soul to some regime or some other person, it's anti-democratic. It's terrible. It's what has happened to the 70 million voters on the other side of the divide, I think. So yeah, that's one of my obsessions.
Makes sense. I have a question, a more technical question about point of view. You're a master of point of view. This story you just read was in the first person, but many of your short stories and novels are deploy what narrative theorists sometimes call free indirect style, and what I believe in the creative writing world is now being called close third. And I wonder, is that something that you picked up early, something you practice and teach? Do you see it as a core of how you approach the challenge of writing a particular narrative? How do you master point of view, get into all the different voices and characters that populate your fiction?
The beauty of what we do, and I can barely see the audience, but I know that about 99% are my fellow writers, is that we're so various, and we have our own approaches and our own ways of mining a story or telling a story. And again, I know it's disappointing to people who want answers of how you do it. How you do it is totally so individual, there's no way to explain it. I just somehow feel comfortable with it. I don't think about it. A voice begins to talk to me and I follow it. And in third person, in many of my recent novels, the aforementioned Outside Looking In, or even Talk to Me last year, the most current novel, Talk to Me, I'm giving 3 opposing points of view. And in Talk to Me, I had so much fun because this is, by the way, this is a replay of Descent of Man, the title story of my first book, which I wrote here at the workshop when I discovered in the 70s that we were doing experiments with primates to learn about language acquisition and teach them our language, and of course they use sign language. It's fascinating. And what does it have to say ethically about our treatment of animals, and et cetera. And so in this particular scenario, as in the very first little absurdist story I wrote, there are 3 point of view characters. Amy, who is the student and helper of a professor who is conducting these experiments, and Sam, who is sort of based on Nim. You want to have your heart broken, just read the biography of Nim. Oh, horrible. Anyway, the fun for me was to inhabit Sam's point of view. Alternating chapters are from the point of view of the ape himself. That is a wonderful, for me, leap of the imagination, and it is a grinding of point of view and a test of point of view. Can it work?
So let's talk about talk to me a little more. I was fascinated by those sections in which you inhabited Sam's point of view, and that partly led to the way I formulated that question. What were the challenges in inhabiting a chimp's point of view? Did you have to, I don't know, alter your methodology, or were there ways that you practiced to do that? I know that there were, the one thing I'm sure everyone who's read it will notice is you do capitalize certain terms, I assume, to foreground the limited vocabulary of the chimp relative to the humans.
To the narration. The narration is tricky because all narration is tricky. You know, even a story like this in first person, you know that it's not real, that there's an author manipulating this. And so that was the most interesting part for me, is giving Sam's point of view and what he can know and what he can perceive. And yet, of course, we all know the trick of fiction is that there is the writer directing this. It was a lot of fun.
Well, we've got some questions from the audience here. And I thank all the folks online and from the audience for contributing these questions. And let me just throw a few out there, see what you think. How can men in the field of writing and literature support women and non-binary people in the field?
I have no idea. I don't even know what it means.
Can't help you with that.
I'm not into supporting people in the field. I'm into being an artist making art.
You've said that writing is about finding things out and exploring. What has been the most outrageous thing you have found out in your writing career?
I don't understand the question. About subject matter?
I think about the world. And in fact, maybe this refers to your fascinating quote up there that you basically hold the opposite opinion of the standard professional dictum, write what you know. And you're like, write what you don't know, explore what you don't know. And it's clear that you do see writing partly as an exploratory experience for the writer.
Entirely, actually, Lauren. I just want to find something out. And with historical novels, of course, I have to absorb material, and in the process of doing that, I think it frees up the unconscious to begin to develop scenarios. The hardest part of any novel, as so many of you will know, is the middle, because you've started in a burst, and suddenly you're stranded on an island, and you don't know why you're doing it or what it means, what the themes are, and it's always hard to move on from there. But I have persisted even when it seemed hopeless, and I've been fairly happy with the results. The example is San Miguel, my novel about the island of that name off of Santa Barbara, where I live. While I was doing When the Killing's Done, an ecological book on Santa Cruz Island, I discovered these two narratives, one a memoir and the other a fragmentary diary of two women who had lived on this island with their families in separate periods and were utterly miserable. Of course, what could be better for a novel? But the challenge for me was I wanted to replicate their voices. So I wrote a straightforward, realistic novel without using the irony that comes so easily to me. And I almost gave up about halfway through. And then, speaking of point of view, I had felt that the husband's point of view had to be in there, and I cut it. And the novel began to flow for me, and I just gave the women's point of view, and it seemed to work. It's always an exploration and a discovery.
Have you ever given up?
I haven't. No. I haven't given up. On certain stories, of course, I'll look at a story, I'd write a paragraph or two and realize that it's not working for me. But no, I've not given up on a longer project so far.
So we've got some questions here about specific work. I'm a graduate student and I research debris flow initiation. Your piece, The Absence of Montecito, has been an incredible motivation for me. 4 years later, is the tragedy still personal? And this can lead to our question also about your turn to ecological and environmental concerns, or what some people are calling cli-fi, climate fiction. Can you talk a little bit about that concern?
Sure. So, as some of you may know, we're having a constant catastrophe of weather in California, as I predicted in 2000 with a friend of the Earth. Not that it gives me any satisfaction. I have nothing but terror. In Montecito, where I live, we had a fire 4 years ago that started in Ventura. Here's the story. I'm going out to get my newspaper at 6 a.m., and there is my wife's sister, who lives in Ventura, with her two children, her multiple dogs and cats and so on, in the car, in the driveway. What are they doing there? Well, a fire had burst out in Ventura. It took a full month to work its way all the way across the mountain chain to Santa Barbara. And it was terrifying. The sky was black, as in the desolation of smog. The police made us leave, and so on and so on. I thought it was hopeless. But the firemen stopped it, and we were okay. A month later, the once-in-a-100-year weather event happened, and we had a lightning strike and a violent storm on the denuded ground. And in the middle of the night, a debris flow started. And you hear mudslide, and you think, well, what is that? It's a 40-foot wall of water moving at the speed of an automobile and bristling with automobiles, boulders the size of this stage, and crushed up cars and everything else. And it went to the ocean and killed 23 of my neighbors. We were not affected directly because we are on the hill. Just below us, where the creek comes, is where this mass of water and boulders and so on came. It's terrifying. So I wrote that. The New Yorker asked me to write about it, so I wrote that essay for them. But I also wrote a short story, which is the title story of the new collection, I Walk Between the Raindrops, which takes off from that event.
And did you find that there were specific challenges to that? A lot of the criticism on climate fiction says that the scale of time makes it harder to write about and harder to understand for human beings, and that part of the reason we are failing so poorly in responding to it has to do with our inability to conceive of scale. So
Absolutely.
Do you still write, though, just a story on the human scale, or did you try to write maybe in a larger, geological time?
My story, Chicxulub, does that. But in A Friend of the Earth from 2000, I was projecting to 2026. By 2015, we were already where I had projected we'd be in terms of these problems, in terms of species extinction and dramatic climate catastrophes, and even a pandemic.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I'm a wise guy. I'm thinking, oh, I'll be dead by the time this happens. And here it is, staring us all in the eye.
Speaking of catastrophes and disasters, I did want to ask you about the pandemic, how it's affected your career. You're one of a number of writers who foresaw it and wrote about it in some ways before it hit. But I wondered how you thought, how the pandemic has affected your own career, and maybe how it's affecting the literary world as we see both people writing about it now, but also people returning to earlier narratives about plagues and thinking about the way in which writers engage, I guess I could say, the plague as plot, or the plague as a scenic setting for narration.
As we're all well aware, we are living in the sci-fi movies from the 1970s and 80s. And Zoom is part of it. I am so tired of Zoom. Zoom is bizarre because when you look at a screen, your brain is in a different place from when you're having a conversation face to face or performing. And it's horrible and dreary. And we were luckier than most because we live in a small village, and the ocean is there, and the forest is there, and there were no prohibitions about going outside, and we were all at social distancing because there was nobody else around. That was all good. What got me down was the loss of community. I love this town for the richness of the community, and in our little town we have a pretty good community too. I just missed human contact. On the plus side, you recall the first month or so? Oh man, nobody was going anywhere. I would go out before bed at 11 o'clock at night and just walk to the gate and look out into the blackness. No motorcycles, no sounds of anything or anybody, just the bugs.
You did get a sense of how peaceful the world would be without humans for a period of time. This sort of translates into this next question: what keeps you motivated? I know Charity Nebby asked you, how do you maintain hope? In some ways, I suppose writing must do that for you. But what does keep you motivated? What keeps you writing, and what keeps you writing in a way that is engaged with a world which is so buffeted by the kinds of disasters and tragedies we're talking about here?
It's an obsessive compulsive behavior, and I'm sure there are drugs that could cure it.
Well, and you've compared it to addiction too. Do you see, is talent and addiction, is that a relationship that you've thought about or that applies to you? I know your piece for Frank Conroy's book, The 11th Draft, talks about writing as an addiction, and some folks, I think, do experiencing it that way. Other folks maybe have to force themselves to do it. But is it an addiction, or is it an addiction for you? And what does that say about
I don't know about
art?
other people, but it's certainly an addiction for me, and it's a positive addiction in that it gives me something to do in life. We all need something to do, and otherwise we have to contemplate who we are, where we are, and what our eventual fate as individuals and a species is, and that is pretty hard to deal with. So we need to do something, and in my case, it's controlling the world through creating other worlds. What
is something you wish people ask you about more? I had to read that one. I know you must. There's a sort of nervous feeling of asking someone with all your experience these questions, because I can't imagine but that you've answered them all before, and there must be some you're more tired of than others. Here's one about how should I get published, and I'm sure you've gotten that one before. But
I don't mind. I'm a teacher. I had all my students, and I don't mind, and I hear the same question over and over. It doesn't really bother me. What I could be asked about more is, would you like another helping of spaghetti? Is this check big enough?
Can I buy you a drink? What is your advice for young writers? One or two of the questions here are about that. And the literary world has changed since you entered it. It's still a vibrant and rich literary world. I don't believe in the people who say there's some sort of decline going on. But it has changed. It's gone digital. It's very corporate. What's your advice to people who want to get into writing, or how do you speak to young writers today?
Well, of course, I love a shtick. And all of my shtick was the original, spontaneous. But here is the standard answer I give. come from a very wealthy family.
So my advice is always don't go into debt. When people ask me, should I go to graduate school? Should I? I'm like,
I never made such a calculation, and I suppose our era was different, but I didn't think about making a living or money or anything else. I never have. I've never written anything thinking, oh, wow, this will sell and I'll make money. No. And it's part of the feeling of Iowa, of who we were here. I presume the students are still the same way. We're doing this because we love to do it. That's why we do it. We would do it anyway. So I never really concerned myself much along those lines. And I've been very fortunate. Obviously, I had an audience and the critics behind me from the beginning, and it really helps to be ratified, and as we said much earlier in the discussion, to have mentors whom you admire and whose work you admire say, yeah, I like this and you're on the right track. That's what we need. Makes sense.
In short story mode, do you finish a draft in one sitting?
No, never. It's a slow process where I feel my way into the unconscious mind, and when I'm tired that day or I get to the end of a scene and it's over, I put it aside, don't think about it consciously until the next day. And the process of everyone that does this, of going over it and going over it, gets you, maybe if you're lucky, into that unconscious place again. And so a story like you just heard here would maybe take a month from inception to finished draft.
Now, you mentioned that Tortilla Curtain is probably your most commonly read book and maybe a lot of folks' favorite book of yours. Do you have your own favorite book of yours?
Because I'm asked constantly,
yeah.
I have to answer my first novel, which I began here, Water Music, because it is so insane. I could never write anything like that ever again. And it's the first, so it's a special favorite of mine. But of course, I never put out anything that I don't love. And everything that's coming, the new novel I just finished, I'm loving that. It's hard to choose.
Are you able to keep up with contemporary fiction? Are there writers you're reading now?
I do, but I cannot write a novel and read somebody else's novel at the same time, because you get voice creep. But when I'm writing stories, as I am now, I can begin to read other writers. And when I finished Outside Looking In and was about to begin Talk to Me, I picked up one of my favorite books off the shelf, which is Lucky Jim. Because it's so different from what I was doing and so funny. And so the first story I wrote of the new round of stories reflected some of that. And so I've just delivered Blue Skies, which is my next novel for next year, and it's cli-fi, which is a term I love. And it's like A Friend of the Earth. It projects 10 years in the future with regard to global warming, but most particularly what alerted me was the sudden dearth of flying insects that have declined 80% around the world. Just think about that, folks, the food chain and what we've done to it. In any case, I've finished and delivered that, and I have with me right now Lucky Jim again.
One of the first great academic novels, you've written about academics, but you haven't really written the sort of standard academic satire, and you don't write about creative writing classrooms or creative writing. Have you written any novels
about
about
No, I haven't, but the Kinsey book has an academic field behind it.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
And so this
Talk
to
Me,
and
Timothy
Talk
Leary
to Me
too
has,
is,
and Leary with his class, and Talk to Me too.
I found Talk to Me to be bleak. You seemed pretty pessimistic about interspecies. And Charity asked you about this too, and at first I was going to say, your novels feel like everything's going to be tragic and it's going to be a complete disaster, and then you actually pull back. I mean, Tortilla Curtain also does this, where you think that really everything's going to fall apart tragically, and actually you do maintain, I don't know whether it's hope, but at least a sort of realism. It's not like everything is falling in. Talk to Me, I found myself pretty sad after reading it and felt like you were skeptical certainly of academia and primate study, but also skeptical maybe of interspecies communication. That relationship didn't work out very well.
One of my close friends is a guy who's never been out of New York City, and he's a gourmand. and he knows the other species only as he sees them on the plate. That's sort of the way
Yeah,
that it
no,
goes.
I got that sense.
I don't have a lot of hope for our species or for the species we're driving to extinction, but my hope and joy come from creating these scenarios. I think the climax of Talk to Me, if you're not sobbing, you were born without a soul. I'm sorry. I sobbed throughout. It is tragic, it is difficult, but I hope that there is joy in the art itself, and joy in where it's taking you and how it provokes you and what it makes you think about. That said, I think we're getting to the end of this.
Yeah, well,
Warren.
I was going to say that was a lovely note on which to stop, the joy in the art
Good man.
itself. Thank you so much, Tom.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So thank you for sharing your work with us, for being so generous in answering our questions, spending the evening with us. I know it's been a while since you've been out sharing stories with live audiences, and we're grateful you came home to Iowa City to give us your time. To our audience members here at the Englert and online all over the country, we're so glad you could join us. You may find Talk to Me and other works by T.C. Boyle wherever books are sold, including Prairie Lights. You can also read an interview with Tom in the online issue of Iowa Magazine at magazine.foriowa.org. For those of you who are joining us here this evening, Tom will be signing books upstairs in the lounge, and we hope you will make your way up there to see him. We have a wide range of exciting programming planned for our alumni and friends coming up. Don't miss the next Chat from Old Cap featuring Tom's friends Robin Green and Mitchell Burgess, Iowa Writers Workshop alums and Hollywood writers and producers of such acclaimed shows as The Sopranos, Northern Exposure, and Blue Bloods. Be sure to register today for this virtual event taking place on May 18th. I hope you'll join us for upcoming Literary Legends programming and other future events. Thank you for being here, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
much I love you. But never know how much I care. But when you put your arms around me, I get a fever that's so hard to bear. You give me a fever. When you kiss me, a fever. When you hold me tight, a fever. In the morning, baby, but temperature all through the night. Alright. Sun lights up the daytime, moon lights up the night.